in Ukraine. There was a statement that the Secretary made on Saturday regarding the strike in Odesa. Just following up on that, does the United States believe this was a violation of the agreement reached in Turkey?
So you saw the statement from the Secretary over the weekend. As he alluded to at the time, Russia's brazen attack against the port city of Odesa only 24 hours after this agreement was signed, it certainly undermines the credibility of Russia's commitments to the other parties to this deal, the United Nations, Turkey, and Ukraine, as well as its broader humanitarian commitment that it made in the July 21st agreement. It also highlights, we believe, that Moscow continues to behave in ways that intentionally prevent desperately needed food from reaching many of the world's most poor, those who are suffering the most acute effects of the food insecurity that Moscow's invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated. Despite these attacks, we do understand that the parties are continuing preparations to open Ukraine's Black Sea ports for food and fertilizer exports. We are clear-eyed going forward, but we also continue to expect that the Black Sea Agreement will be implemented. We know that the world will be watching, as you heard from the Secretary. We will be working with our partners around the world to see to it that Moscow is held accountable for the agreement it reached. And that's why we'll continue to remain in close coordination with President Zelensky, the government of Ukraine, the Secretary General, our Turkish allies, who were instrumental in bringing this agreement to conclusion.
Can I follow on this?
So you think this agreement will endure? I mean, despite this attack and possibly similar attacks in the future, that's how you see it? It's enduring?
This agreement needs to endure. The people throughout the world, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, parts of the Indo-Pacific, who have suffered the worst consequences of food insecurity that Moscow's invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated. It needs to endure for their benefit. We have heard from the parties that they're moving forward with preparations to see an initial tranche of food and fertilizer move out in the coming days. It is certainly our hope that that happens. But again, we're also clear-eyed. We acknowledge that Moscow's track record when it comes to previous deals that it has struck is not exactly a cause for optimism. It harkens back to what we heard and what we saw from Russia in the context of the humanitarian corridors that were to have been open for evacuations of civilians and others from the siege cities. In some cases, those humanitarian corridors were open for just a few days, or in some cases, just a few hours before Moscow appeared to renege on its agreement. In this case, it's very clear that Moscow, as one of my colleagues put it last week, has felt the heat of global opprobrium because the world now knows, it is now clear that rising food prices, rising energy prices, food insecurity more broadly has been exacerbated by, in recent months, one cause more than any other, and that is Russia's war against Ukraine. It's very clear that Russia has felt the pressure. For those of you who were with us in Bali, Indonesia, the other week for the G20 foreign ministers meeting, many of you saw this up close. The only walkout from the G20 was not by the United States, not by any one of our allies and partners, but by Foreign Minister Lavrov, who, after sitting through a number of statements of strong condemnation, a number of statements of strong concern from countries around the world who have felt the acute pain of this growing food insecurity, determined that he had heard enough, and he left the session, before the session, in fact, on global food insecurity. So it's clear that the world has been able to speak largely with one voice on this. We will continue to do what we can to support the UN, to support our Turkish allies, because we know the importance of this grain, of this fertilizer, reaching global markets.
So you said last week that Russian grain is not in any way sanctioned, or there are no sanctions.
That's right.
But the Russians claim that there are secondary sanctions that impact their ability to export their grain and so on. Can you comment on that?
The Russians have made a number of claims in recent days, but also over recent months in the context of Russia and Ukraine that amount to nothing more than misinformation or in some cases disinformation. The fact is that we have been very specific in designing this sanctions regime to see to it that food and fertilizer from Russia is entirely exempted, to see to it that companies around the world have the assurances that they need to export these products, knowing the vital role that Ukraine's grain, Ukraine's fertilizer and food from the region plays, given that it is essentially a breadbasket for the world.
Ned, you keep saying this, making this comment to the Russians being isolated and Lavrov walking out of the G20. You know, the guy just has just finished up a 4 or 5 country tour of Africa, starting in Egypt, going to Ethiopia, and Uganda, and Congo. That's not exactly a picture of isolation, is it?
I think you were there. You saw and you heard some of the messages that emanated from the G20. The G20 being a fairly diverse cross-section of countries with diverse interests and perspectives, but there was a broad consensus among this collection of countries, some of the world's leading economies, that Russia should be condemned for its actions, that its actions were exacerbating and perpetuating the global food crisis. It is becoming clear that Russia is recognizing that its own actions have caused it to become a pariah. I made an allusion to this a moment ago, but
so you're saying that these trips the defense minister was just in Turkey, right, signing this agreement. Now, what happened in Odesa happened in Odesa, but I mean, he went there. President Putin was just in Iran. Okay, fine, it's Iran, and you might say that okay, that shows desperation. But so you're saying that all these foreign visits that they're doing are signs of desperation of Russia's increasing isolation, because it doesn't really compute that way.
It's very clear that Foreign Minister Lavrov is seeking to engage with countries to try to stem the onslaught of outrage against Russia. We've made this point before. We are much less concerned with whom Russia is speaking and the messages that Russia is hearing from countries. The message that Foreign Minister Lavrov heard, the message that Russia heard from the G20, the message that Russia has heard from the UN, the message that Russia has heard from other countries, other blocs of countries, has been increasingly clear about the toll of Moscow's invasion, the toll of Moscow's brutal aggression against Ukraine.
May I follow on grain?
Sure, please.
Ambassador Power told CNN today that U.S. administration is preparing so-called Plan B, means alternative plan to transport grain from Ukraine. Could you provide more details, and does it mean that we need this plan in case if Istanbul Agreement will not work, or it will be realized at the same time?
So we are looking at all options when it comes to the disposition of Ukrainian grain, and we're working with our Ukrainian partners who are, in the first instance, responsible for seeing the export of their grain, because it is, again, their grain. It is clear that opening Ukraine's Black Sea ports would be the most effective means by which to increase exports of Ukrainian grain and other foodstuffs. We've made this point before, but there are some 20 tons of grain that are in Ukraine's Black Sea ports, ready to go, have been ready to go for, in some cases, months, and they have been stuck there owing principally to one element and one element alone. That is Russia's blockade of the Black Sea. But all along, we've made the point that we are looking at and helping our Ukrainian partners with every option to increase Ukrainian grain exports. And in fact, prior to the signing of this deal, Ukraine's grain exports have increased somewhat, given the use of overland routes, given other tactics that our Ukrainian partners have put into play. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine was exporting some 6 tons of grain per month. Ukraine is nowhere near that at the present, but Ukraine's exports have increased month over month from February to March to April to May and in subsequent months. So we have been able to work with them to increase those exports in some ways, but we all know that the most effective means and the largest scale means by which to increase those exports will be through the Black Sea. Sean.